Batol was originally a Cataclysm dungeon, but has been reworked in order to be brought back in Season 1 of The War Within. In this video, we're going to briefly walk through the newish bosses. Let's go. Starting with General Umbriss, this boss has only a handful of abilities. First, Umbriss will start with Commanding Roar, which causes a burst of group damage. Shortly after this, Twilight Drakes will heed the call of Umbriss, unleashing Shadow Flame upon the arena. Players will need to identify the safe area and move to that zone quickly. During this time, Umbriss will also cast Rock Spike. This will target a few players who will need to spread out. This will cause moderate physical damage to the targeted players, and once the debuff expires, it'll also leave behind Rumbling Earth. Don't stand in these, and bonus points if you drop them near the edge of the room. Lastly, tanks will need to be aware of the Skull Splitter Tank Buster. This will have Umbriss lashing out in a series of attacks that deal moderate damage and cause bleeding for a brief period of time. Make sure you're using a defensive, and healers, make sure you're spot healing them if needed. This is a pretty fast-paced encounter that will just repeat these mechanics until Umbriss falls. The core mechanic of Forgemaster Throngus is that he's going to rotate his weapons throughout the encounter, changing the abilities that he casts. Whenever he changes a weapon, there will be pulsing group damage, so healers, be ready. Starting the fight though, the Forgemaster will yield his axe. This grants him the ability Fiery Cleave. This is a frontal cone targeted at a random player, so ideally you're going to want to bait this towards the wall. After this cast finishes, it'll leave fire in its wake, reducing your total encounter space. After this, he will cast Forged Swords, swapping weapons. This grants him access to the ability Molten Flurry, which is basically a tank buster. Tanks, be ready to use a defensive here, and players marked with arrows above their head will drop pools of fire shortly after. Make sure you're placing this near old fire. Last but not least, the Forgemaster will cast Forged Mace, which grants him the ability Molten Mace, causing him to be slowed by 50%, but increasing his damage done by 1000%. Tanks will absolutely need to run here. His auto attacks will become basically lethal in high enough keys. After this pursuit ends, it's simply a rinse and repeat, starting the cycle over. Mr. Shadowburner is a two-phase encounter. Starting off, you're going to notice that this boss will cast Shadow Flame Bolt. Just make sure you interrupt this. He will then cast Invocation of Shadow Flame. This will spawn a lethal swirl that will also spawn an ad shortly after that fixates a random player. Use any types of slow here to keep the ad at bay and do your best to cleave it down without letting it touch the fixated player. It's worth mentioning that coordinated groups can CC these ads if they'd like to. Next, we have the cast of Curse of Entropy. This will apply a few curses to players, which works in 3 parts. It'll deal damage over time, it'll reduce the player's movement speed, and also absorb healing. Ideally, classes with curse spells can remove this, but healers should work on healing through the absorb, which will remove the debuff. Once Drahga reaches 1 health, he will flee, leading into phase 2. During this phase, Drahga will continue to summon ads, but now it'll be 2 of them. Again, if these ads reach a fixated player, it's most likely going to be a wipe. Valiona, the dragon, will cast Twilight Buffet, which will deal group damage and knock everyone back. Did I just say buffet? We'll leave it in. The Devouring Flame cast is also a frontal cone, just make sure you're doing your best to dodge this. And last but not least, avoid the little tornadoes around the room. This fight really comes down to ad control and management. The boss dies once it reaches 0 health. Last but not least, we have Erudax, the Duke of Below. This boss is hectic, to say the least. Currently, this is how the boss operates. Shortly upon pulling the boss, he will cast Void Surge. This will deal group damage and spawn swirls. Try not to get hit. These swirls though will also spawn tentacles, and if you come into contact with these tentacles, you're going to take damage and you're going to be stunned for a long time. Next, we have Shadow Gale. This will summon an encroaching darkness. Tanks, you're going to want to keep an eye out for this and get ready to move the boss to the safe spot. While moving, make sure you're avoiding tentacles. Once you are in this tiny little space, the boss will cast Abyssal Corruption, which will place a dot on 3 players and deal pretty massive damage over time. It'll also deal damage to any player standing in the small circle surrounding them, so do your best to spread and use the defensive. Last but not least, Void Infusion will be cast by the boss, and this will summon little minions. Make sure you are grouped up in your melee and cut them down quickly. The caveat here is that these ads, when they die, will cause your group to take increased shadow damage, 5% per stack to be exact. So killing them at the right point will be pivotal in high content. Oh, and I forgot to mention that there's a tank buster called Crush. This will deal moderate damage and knock the tank backwards, so just be prepared for this. After that, the boss basically repeats those abilities in that order, but the fight does get increasingly harder with more and more tentacles in the arena. This is going to be either a great boss or a disastrous one. Anyways, best of luck, and a massive shout out to all my lovely Patreon supporters. Bet you all look extra cute today. Anyways, peace.